Drive, KSCO Studios. You can pick up your longevity stuff all day long. It's 206. Time for Planet Watch with Rachael Goodman and Joe Jordan. We're also streaming online live on YouTube at KSCO Global.
Welcome to Planet Watch. I'm Rachael Ann Goodman with Joe Jordan and intern Tommy Martin. Coming up this hour, two scientists talk about water resources and ecosystems in a changing planet. We'll talk with University of California evolutionary biologist Professor Erica Zavaleta about her work on ecosystems and how they adapt to extreme changes in climate. And with Dr. Adina Payton, Professor of Marine Sciences at UC Santa Cruz, about the recent Oroville Dam failure and other water resource stories unfolding as our climate changes here in California and elsewhere. We'll also get a preview of the upcoming UC Santa Cruz Climate Change Conference. If you want to ask our guests a question, you can write down this email, radioplanetwatch@gmail.com. And I'd like to welcome my co-host, Joe Jordan. Hi, Joe. How are you doing today?
Hey, Rachel and Tommy and Jason and Adina and everybody else out there in Radioland.
There is a Radioland. I hear it's actually on a map in Planet Watch universe, alternative universe. That's called Radioland. If you look it up on the GPS, you'll find it right at AM 1080 and elsewhere on the dial. So we have a couple of news items we'd like to share with you, and then we're going to dive right into our guests. But first, the news.
Yeah, I've got a lead-off story here today. University of Toronto engineering innovation could make printing of solar cells as easy and inexpensive as printing a newspaper. Dr. Hiran Tan and his team have cleared a critical manufacturing hurdle in the development of a relatively new class of solar devices called perovskite solar cells. That's Perovskite. This alternative solar technology could lead to low-cost, printable solar panels capable of turning nearly any surface into a power generator. Thanks to Science Daily for that report. And I'm just going to comment that I've been telling folks about perovskites for a long time, and I'm glad that we're starting to really finally hear about it in the mainstream. These are rocks. They're based on rocks. I mean, it sounds Russian, right? Perovskites. Well, they were first identified in the Ural Mountains, which any grade school geography expert should know. The Urals are the mountain range that officially divide Europe from Asia. Well, anyway, the other exciting things about the perovskites, and more later on later shows, is that they might well be able to help us sequester vast amounts of carbon from the atmosphere. So you get a double whammy, a double wonderful whammy with these perovskites. So stay tuned.
And coming up next, we have a story. Turns out, all you Californians, that war and violence over resource scarcity has been with us for thousands of years. Studying ancient native burial grounds in Central California, Cal Poly's Dr. Mark Allen found remains showed that about 7% of the population 1,000 years ago in California had evidence of forced traumas, whether they were shot by an arrow, stabbed, or bludgeoned. A percentage of violent trauma not even reached during World War II, said the researcher Mark Allen. And this is compared to the environment they lived in. And he made some assumptions based on the scarcity of resources and the amount of violent incidents to say that violent conflict has been with us ever since resource scarcity has. And the image of happy Californians with plenty of food actually turns out to not be exactly correct. So he said the challenge is to figure out what we're going to do when there is resource stress, not to have conflict in the world.
Maybe we need Adina or Rachel or somebody else of the female gender for president. Maybe that's the kind of thing we need to reduce stress and conflict in the world.
Actually, and what was interesting, I think, was 7% of the traumas impacted were male skeletons and 11% were female skeletons. Sounds like everybody was part of the mayhem, and victims and perpetrators. So who knows what it was really like, but there's some assumptions being made now that they're looking at all these burial sites.
It looks like recent Sources were always a source of conflict when they're not abandoned.
Right. And Adina, if I can get you to bring that mic closer, you'll have your higher volume. There we go.
There we
And
go.
Tommy, you have a story that I found really interesting when I first heard about
me
it.
too. It's about once again, ice caps. Drastic measures are being considered to combat the alarming rate at which these Arctic ice caps are melting. According to The Guardian, physicist Stephen Desch and a team from Arizona State University have proposed an idea to build 10 million wind-powered pumps over the Arctic ice cap. In winter, these pumps would be used to bring water to the surface, where it would freeze and thicken the ice cap. Desch argues this process could add an extra meter of sea ice to the shrinking ice caps, which rarely exceed 2 to 3 meters of thickness. Desch and his team have published their plan in Earth's Future, the journal of the American Geophysical Union. They propose a cost of $500 billion, billion with a B, for their extreme answer to our climate crisis. While this price tag may make this proposition seem imaginative, with ice growth stalling in January, completely in the heart of the Arctic winter, it may be given more consideration.
And just to comment on this, $500 billion seems like a lot of money, but imagine the cost dealing with the crisis that all of these weather disruptions and crop disruptions could cost the world. I just think it's probably a sign that these drastic measures, even being discussed, shows either the desperation of some of the scientists proposing it, or they're just perhaps not even really hoping it'll get traction, but they're just wanting to get our attention that things have gotten that bad that people are proposing really kind of crazy ideas just because it has gotten that bad. So I don't know what you think about that.
I want to say something in defense of the idea. I mean, we're going to have to do we're already doing drastic things, okay, in the wrong direction. We need to start doing maybe some drastic things in the right direction. This one, could be feasible. I mean, 10 million's a lot of wind pumps, but hey, how many cars do we make in the world every year now? And as far as the price tag, $500 billion, all right, that's $500 billion. Yeah, it's a lot of money. But look, the thing I wonder about is, okay, those wind pumps are presumably going to be mounted. Maybe they'll be floating. Maybe they'll have floating bases. But if they're anchored to the bottom of the Arctic, this story is so new I haven't had a chance to check this out yet, but there are these methane cleth rates on the bottom of the ocean in various places in the world. We do not want to wake those things up. They may extinguish us. So got to be careful about what's on the bottom, what lurks in the deep in the Arctic. But anyway, so
sounds like a science fiction movie.
Interesting item there.
Life is becoming a little more like a science fiction movie.
Oh, and the idea of pumping the water up, by the way, it's colder water at depth, so it's already got a head start towards freezing. That's why you want to pump up the water from the depth.
Indeed.
Okay.
Well, we're very happy to welcome our two guests to the show. Erica Zavaleta is with us by telephone from Colorado, and she has done work in evolutionary biology. She's studying ecosystems and how they are changing, how rapidly we will find out in the places she's studying them in relation to changing climate. We are also very lucky to be joined in person in the studio by Dr. Adina Payton. She is professor of marine sciences at UC Santa Cruz, and she studies water systems, among other things, both here and I believe in Mexico. So welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be on the show. Thanks for having us.
Hey, Erica, good to hear your voice from Colorado there.
So I think we'll start with you, Erica, and what I wanted to do is just find out a little bit about your research there, what you're studying and what you're seeing. And from an earlier conversation, it sounds like what you're being able to witness is happening in human lifespan time, whereas it might not have in a climate that was not changing so fast. So I wonder if, with that context in mind, you could just give us a brief overview of what you're working on and what you're seeing.
Sure. So as you said, I study the effects of climate change on ecological systems, and I also look at how climate change effects interact with other environmental changes. So climate change is not the only thing that's changing around here. Climate's one of many things that are happening. And so over the last 20 years, my work in that area is focused on California because it's home and it's a really special place, and also on places that are experiencing particularly rapid change. And that's included Arctic and boreal ecosystems up at high latitudes, and now high elevation alpine ecosystems at lower latitudes, which is where I am now in southwestern Colorado. So in both Arctic and alpine systems, we're seeing thresholds crossed more rapidly and seeing things like really, really rapid increases in temperature compared to what we're seeing at lower latitudes and elevation. That means that the timing of biological events is changing faster, water supply timing and amount is changing faster, the responses of ecological communities are happening more quickly, and then people, human communities in those settings are also experiencing this huge range of impacts, and that's people in the individual sense, and it's also people in the sense of industries and livelihoods. So that whole range of things is what I'm interested in. Up here in the high mountains of southwest Colorado, one of the things I've focused in on is actually the responses of North America's highest breeding songbird, the rosy finches. And I was just captivated by how they integrate all of these changes that are happening to snowpack, to temperature, to extreme events all year round, and in other arenas, like to the availability of food for them as introduced fish become more prevalent in high alpine lakes. They also migrate, so they tie together much of Western North America, and they're vulnerable along that whole span, that whole region, to the different kinds of changes that are occurring. So that's one particular thing that I've been paying a lot of attention to the last couple of years.
And Erica, I wonder, are you on a speakerphone? Because if we could get you on a closer up to the mic, maybe of your telephone, we would get a little bit of audio quality boost out of our conversation.
I'm on headphones, but I will take them off and see if that helps.
Okay, let's try that. Yeah, just see if we can get an adjustment on the tech here to continue our conversation.
Does this sound any better?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, great.
Quite a
Okay,
bit,
I'll just
yeah.
hold this one up to my ear.
All right, sounds great. Thank you. So you're seeing animals responding, and you said people because of the industries. Can you give an example of how animals are being able to cope with this rapid change? I mean, throughout history and evolution is your background, right? Animals have been able to adapt to some pretty extreme changes, but maybe not over this short of a period of time. Is that something you're wondering, if some of them will just go extinct because they can't move, or what do you see?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are three reasons why this is different from any past event that animals have had to adapt to. And it's true for people too. One, you just mentioned, it's the pace of change. So the speed with which the climate is changing is much more rapid than we've seen in the past. And there have been brief periods in the past, in long history, of course, when climate has changed really, really rapidly. We're looking now at a sustained event. I mean, this is going to be centuries, unless something really dramatic happens, and it's going to be, at least a century. So there's the pace. There's what other obstacles they're facing. So the landscapes through which animals were able to respond with movement in the past through geological time are all cut up now. We've got urban areas, roads, huge landscapes that are transformed, and so at many different scales, the opportunities for movement are more limited. And then the third difference is that almost every population of wild plants or animals out there has already been reduced in its distribution and reduced in its numbers by quite a bit. So they're just coming from behind to begin with. There are not as many of them with as much genetic diversity to be able to respond to something new like climate change.
So you deal with higher elevations where things are already struggling because of high altitude. What are some of the challenges, some of the critters, and you said you studied birds, and what are some of the other ones you've studied? What are some of their challenges in migrating, moving, and what are you seeing them do? What are they trying to do to try to adapt?
Sure. Well, first of all, things that live at these elevations in places like Colorado, or that live at high latitude, like that live up on the northern slope in Alaska or in the boreal forest at the edge of the northern slope, they're adapted to deal with these extreme environments. So very seasonal environments and a lot of variability and change. So in some ways, they're well set up to deal with a lot of fluctuation and extremes. But they're also adapted to things like snowpack. Snowpack means food availability and moisture availability all the way through the summer, even in a dry, hot climate like the southwestern U.S. at these elevations. And as we're losing snowpack, which is happening very, very fast, that's really changing the water balance in these systems, and that cascades up through the whole food web. So that's one big kind of change we're seeing here. At higher latitudes, that same kind of phenomenon, the earlier melt, the earlier loss of water from the system, and in high latitudes also the loss of permafrost, mean that systems are much more vulnerable to wildfire, and plant communities are changing really fast too. And so you see other kinds of animals, moose, caribou, having to deal with both changing food availability and wildfires, and then also sort of the northward march of the plant communities that they depend on. And so they're moving really fast. We didn't talk about people yet. In Alaska, one of the challenging things about that is that people who depend on all of those animals for food are, they're seeing the animals they've relied on, in some cases for millennia, disappear from the places where they live.
Since you mentioned people, Erica, I was wondering if there's anything that we as people can do to either plan, adapt, reduce the impacts.
Thanks for that question, Adina. It's great to be on the air with you. I just want to say I'm so glad you asked that, because I feel like I'm painting a story of despair. There's a lot that people can do, and I think that's many, many different levels. So we could spend a long time talking about that. But I guess what I would say is that people who live in these particular settings, they have to respond with all kinds of ingenuity and innovation, and in some cases help from the government and so on, to cope with the changes they're seeing. But I think more at the level of our listeners and you and me and our students, when the things we can do are vast. I think they start with things like voting, and then they go on to things like becoming educated about the science of climate change and becoming able to respond to this sort of persistent idea that we're not really sure whether it's happening, whether humans have a role, and what its impacts are, because actually we know a ton about all three of those things. And if the public in the U.S. got behind those realities, that would go a really, really long way in the U.S. to propelling action. So I'm diving right into politics here, but I think that's really, we're the last major country certainly on Earth where this gets raised persistently as a question, as if it wasn't already clear.
And we are going to spend a bit of time today communicating about these kinds of ecological changes to the public in a way that people can hear and understand. So we will definitely dive into that topic at a greater depth in a moment. I think Joe Jordan had a question for
Hey,
you.
so just a minute ago there, Erica, you said boating? No. I mean, we are going to have sea level rise, but not boating, but voting. That's what you said, right? And by the way, I got a random fact I have to interject here. You're calling from 8,000 feet altitude, right?
9,000.
Okay, well, 8,000 feet is where you're above a third of the atmosphere. Did you know that? Anyway.
I had not thought about
She
that.
probably thinks about it every single day. She's climbing a mountain. The breath is
Exactly.
getting. But one of the other, what can we do? There are some desperate things, like we heard earlier. Someone's trying to refreeze the Arctic with spray of water. There's other people who have said, what if we carried some of the plants and animals, in arcs north, because they can't get there that fast. But this is potentially a lot of hubris and assumption that we will know what to save and how to save it. There's seed banks, being saved. What are some of those kinds of solutions that give you pause, and what actually have some real ecological promise to them? I mean, if it's something that has to go up in elevation, there's nowhere for it to go. I can understand something like the pika, those cute little bunny guys. I think there's nowhere else really for them to live except further north. So is there going to be a truckload of pikas heading for Alaska or something? Or the polar bears, where can they go? There's nowhere else. They're talking about their breeding now with brown bears, and may just evolve to eat other things other than seals. But what are some of those kind of edgy but real conversations you've heard scientists having?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think there's a ton going on that's innovative and exciting adaptation, adaptation, sort of healthy things adapt to climate change. One of the things you mentioned, move things around in order to help them.
You
Yeah,
better
that's-
rewind. You better rewind there, Erica. We
Um,
missed the last couple sentences.
And you know
Oh,
what? I'm
sorry.
actually going to recommend if you have a landline and you can call us on a better line. We're having a real suddenly. Our communication devices failed us, and it sounds like it might be on your end, unfortunately. But we could wait while you call back if you want to try that. I want to be able to hear you.
Yeah. Let me try that, and in the meantime, I bet Adina has something
She may
Sure.
chime right
she could
in.
say about that as well. So I'll
Okay.
call you back and be back in a minute.
Thank you. So, Adina, what do you think about that question about, extraordinary measures, innovative ideas, people thinking outside the box when they're talking about saving species?
I think we should think outside the box because the conditions are not the norm. So we have to be innovative. We have to think about creative ideas. We have to be resilient and plan. And we also have to acknowledge that maybe we might lose some species and there's going to be winners and losers. But we have to realize that and take advantage of opportunities and plan for what we can do to best save as much as we can, at least the important things.
That's
to
been
us.
the interesting conversation around the Endangered Species Act, because it was one species at a time. As it got low, there would be a huge plan set into place, and then people started thinking more about ecosystems, which is something Erica studies. And now we're, of course, hearing from our government that they might eliminate the organization, the agency that's supposed to help all this happen, which would be fairly disastrous for those species. But have we been thinking about this whole endangered species thing wrong because you can't just save them one species at a time?
Well, I think species are part of the environment and they're part of the ecosystem. And if we take away their resources, their interactions with other organisms, their food, their water, then they might, even if we save them in captivity, they might not make it in nature. I mean, I think right now, for example, pandas are all pretty much bred by people, taken care by people, and are not going to be there in the wild. So unless we save the whole ecosystem, their food sources and their ability to live in nature, we can't really save them in nature. We can still maintain them in zoos.
And I always find it so ironic that we never think of ourselves as potentially endangered because there's so many of us. But when you're talking about our air and our water being wildly disrupted by climate change, it certainly should be in our imagination to think about that we are primates and we have an ecosystem we rely on. We've manipulated it hugely to become as many as we are. But that doesn't mean we are not subject to the same laws of nature that everything else. When you exceed your resources, is Erica back with us? Hey, Erica, did you? Whoa, not yet. I thought so, but maybe not. Not on that one. Okay, we'll just keep on hoping that she will come back from Boulder or wherever she was on the phone. But meanwhile, while we're waiting for her, I want to turn to you, Adina, and talk to you about your research because it is related to what we've been discussing. And you are on the water resources side of seeing how resources change. And so I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about what you've been discovering. Since this is such a big week in water in California, when the Oroville Dam had 200,000 people evacuated because of potential failure. I guess it's the country's largest dam, right?
Yes, it is.
Quite a story. What did you think when you first heard that story?
Well, what I thought is that that's the first one that happened in this kind of a scale, and there's more to come, and we have to be ready for that. We have to make sure that if dams break, and they will because they're infrastructure and they have a lifetime, we need to be able to plan for that. We need to be able to capture the water so it doesn't go to waste or it doesn't flood and living ecosystems and people, and they evacuated a lot of people over there. Again, with better planning, and maybe when they redo the infrastructure, this water can be used for recharge of aquifers, so we can use it. That's part of planning in a global sense for water security, diversifying our water resources. We all talk about global climate change. However, the global climate change manifests itself differently in different environments, and people and communities and ecosystems really will be impacted differently, and we have to look at adaptation and acclimation to local conditions. So while Erica was talking about Alaska and the higher latitudes, they might be losing sea ice or permafrost over there. Here in California, one of the expected changes is changes in the precipitation and the water system, with having more precipitation as rain and less as the snowpack, more extreme events where longer droughts and then longer years like this year where we have a lot of floods are going to happen. So with that in mind, we can think about how people can adapt, acclimate, take advantage, and plan for these extremes.
Well, it certainly was an alarming, but perhaps not unsurprising story to hear that after, 5 years of drought, we had a potential dam failure from overflow. That was surprising and scary for a lot of people. And the way the news cycle, now I'm going to transition to the other topic, the way the news cycle covers things like, what is it, the bombogenesis, this giant pineapple splat that California's about to get and has been getting as a isolated, weather story, and the dam as, a kind of an accidental failure, but not the connection between all these historic events, which is something you're able to do. And I think Erica's back with us as well. I don't know if you heard that last bit of conversation, Erica.
Hi, can you hear me better this time?
A little bit. You're still with us, a
Okay.
little crackly, but we can
Okay.
definitely understand you, and I'll let you know if that ceases to be the case. We were just talking about extreme weather shifts and trying to understand them in a historic context, as Adina does, rather than what the news does, which is an isolated story that kind of falls off the front page after the immediate danger is over. And talking about communicating climate change, we have some slides that Adina brought in about communicating about this. And if you are listening on the radio and you want to go check them out on our Facebook page, go to Radio Planet Watch on Facebook, and you will find them on there as JPEGs, so you can look at the photographs of her slides. And maybe the two of you can tell us how you go about communicating these complex scientific issues to the public in a clear way, so that they can understand what's at stake in their own lives. And I'll start with you, Adina, and then Erica, you can chime in.
Well, I think since we're not always able to convince everybody or to make everybody focus on the facts, I think what really matters is the tone matters, the narrative matters, and making a connection, connecting to people matters. So the way we need, or I try to go about communicating issues of science, climate, particularly climate change, is trying to remove the doomsday factor, trying to remove the blame factor, and trying to help people understand from themselves the scientific process and how they can look at or understand science facts, science principles, be able to look at observations, and then if they can do that, they can arrive to their own conclusions and not bring a belief factor into the game.
And I see on your slide you said that 40% of Americans Oops. I see on your slide that 40% of Americans cannot name a fossil fuel, and 51% cannot name a renewable energy source. So there's a lot of work to be done. Erica, what have you found when you travel around the country speaking about this issue? You're speaking at an upcoming climate change conference, which assumably the public coming to it already have an interest and probably are not in that 40% population.
Yeah, there's a climate conference at UCSC this coming weekend, next weekend. It's free and open to the public, and so I'm just going to take a minute to make sure that listeners do know about that. You need to register at climateconference.ucsc.edu, and there's a Friday night featured speaker. He's one of the leading scientists in for 40 years now in piecing together what all the ways are that human activities are influencing greenhouse gas composition and the climate. And then all day on Saturday, the focus is on solutions and responses, including communication. So I'd encourage anyone who's able to get there to go ahead and sign up and come. It's a great way to learn more about not just the problem, but what to do about it. For me, in terms of communication, I think it's really, really important to do two things. One is that people are experiential learners. And what I mean by that is that I think people make observations about the world in the most fundamental way. Everybody's doing science all the time, but it's hard to see a change in the likelihood of extremes or a sort of decades-long shift in mean temperatures or the frequency of drought. These are things that maybe with a little bit of direction becomes much easier for people to see. So I like to show people things like time series of the polar ice cap extent and show people long-term weather data from where they live, because you might not notice over 30 years the changes occurring. And many people do, but if you don't, it can be helpful to sort of be able to experience that information in a visual way. And so I think that's one thing that's really important. The other thing I'd say is that, it's really, really easy to go into denial or despair when presented with what an enormous problem this is and how complex the solutions are. But I do think there are a lot of things, as I said before, that people can do, that governments can do, and so I tend to want to focus there and to talk about things like the incredible moves that China has made just in the last month to cut down on its carbon emissions. And it's not really complicated stuff. They're just doing things like canceling plans for hundreds of power plants that would be coal-powered and then enacting plans to build a lot of wind energy capacity. That's really, really promising, and it points to a place to put energy. You put energy into efforts in China and India and California and places where there is a lot of receptivity to moving on this issue of reducing the pace of climate change. I think it's also really exciting to point out things like how much energy markets in the U.S. have actually changed. And so even if, for instance, the clean energy plan goes away, wind has achieved price parity with fossil fuel sources in about a quarter of the U.S. now, and that's expanding rapidly, and also in 30 other countries. So, even if you are really, really wedded to the idea that the market has to solve this, there are ways to, there are hopeful examples out there, and there are ways to help nudge those changes over the edge. It's not like it's a really, really uphill battle everywhere in the world, even though it feels that way sometimes here.
Right. If you just joined us, I'm speaking with Erica Zavaleta. She is a professor at the University of California, Santa Cruz, and she'll be speaking at the upcoming Climate Change Conference. And this is Planet Watch. If you'd like to ask our guests a question, we have a little bit more time at radioplanetwatch@gmail.com. And I don't know if we have any questions just yet, but if you'd like to slip them in under the wire, we also have Dr. Adina Payton in the studio, and I'd like to give her a chance to respond to what Erica just said, and then we'll go to your question.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I completely agree with Erica that people need to understand that observation and hands-on and having their own experience is the best way to do that. So if you can demonstrate in a classroom or in an exhibit, for example, how greenhouse gas work, and people look at this themselves, they can, if any misconception or misunderstanding they have can be changed by their personal experience. And then once you know the fundamentals, you can then look at the same thing that Erica says, records of changes of concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and understand the consequences of that. And similarly, the other point she made about not only communicating doomsday, but actually pointing out the opportunities, because there are opportunities over here that we have to understand and we have to prepare and we have to plan for, whether it's, thinking about different industries and investing in them.
And I did notice, connecting it back to the climate conference, one whole track at the conference is communicating about climate change with the public. So a lot of scientists will be there figuring out how to make it clear and understandable and simple for people to grasp. I don't always think it's the science that's the problem. I think it's people have an emotional resistance to believing there's something big happening to our world that feels potentially destabilizing. There's a natural denial built into many people who don't see it in their everyday lives. And as you said, if you can connect it, it becomes less of a abstract thought. Perhaps. Joe, did you have a question?
Well, I was just going to mention that Erica is actually going to be talking on that evening policy panel on Saturday evening at the conference up at UCSC next weekend. And Erica, I was still scratching my head a little bit about how you see the relationship between what you're doing professionally in your research and this issue of, climate communication or policy. What's the, kind of why did they bring you in to that panel, or what's your view of that?
That's a great question. So I think part of why is that, as I said, as an ecologist, I look at the effects of climate change and other environmental impacts on natural systems, but I've, for a long time, just been very, very committed to also working with other sectors and working on practical solutions. And so a big chunk of my work is scientific and policy and practice responses to the impacts of climate change. So studying how, at a national and an international level, people are responding to things like changing water availability and wildfire frequency and changing levels of threat to wildlife that people care about, and then also looking at what works. Does it work to move things? My student Sarah Skickney and I have been looking at hundreds of cases in the past. This is kind of like what Adina does, looking at the past to understand the future. Hundreds of cases where people have already moved things, not because of climate change, but for other reasons, to get them out of the way of an introduced predator that otherwise would drive them extinct, for instance. And so looking at those hundreds of cases where you've actually already done this to understand how do you make it work, for what kinds of species does it work. So what are people doing and what works from a scientific and a policy perspective, both I think are really important. And then the other thing I'd say, and this echoes what Adina has already spoken about, is that our jobs as scientists, part of it is to do the science, but then a big part of the scientific process is communicating it. And that's not just to other scientists, that's also to the public and to policymakers and so on. And so that's an area that I've felt really strongly about making sure I'm contributing to as a scientist for a long time.
Adina, do you find that it's become easier?
I think that it's not necessarily easier, but it's something we all have to do. It's our responsibility as scientists to be able to communicate to everyone and not just to our peers, because we're the one who know. And with this knowledge, we have such a tool that we can take advantage of and be able to communicate. And I think that it's something that can be learned. I think it maybe does not come naturally to all scientists, but scientists can learn how to communicate better to the general public.
And do you think we're in an era of anti-intellectualism and anti-science? Is there a reason why a bunch of scientists are planning a march to Washington? And some people would say, why are you getting involved with politics? But are we in some new era that may, in the United States anyway, that may cause people who are normally shy and quiet and in the laboratory to feel like they have to step out and say something or do something different?
Well, it's about time that we do.
Amen.
I guess that a lot of your colleagues agree. I think of people like James Hansen, who have been so vocal, and he's even been arrested a few times because of his conviction that this is real and people need to pay attention. But he has been attacked by some of the people who want to pay quite a price for him. Maybe he felt like it was a price he was willing to pay for his grandchildren, but he has been attacked personally.
Yes, that is true, and I think partly this whole issue of climate change has become so politicized that we do end up with personal attacks and with people believing or not believing, and that's why I think we have to kind of try to roll the wheel back and try to look at why is it that people have these very strong and emotional feelings specifically about this issue, and try to maybe diffuse some of that and come back to the level that people can understand us. Take out some of the emotion and go back to change the tone and the narrative and try to connect with people the way that they can understand us without the blame factor, without pointing fingers, but rather looking for solutions.
Erica?
I totally agree with that focus on solutions. I do feel like, just as you said, this is a really, really different time in the U.S. I think the nature of knowledge has really gotten muddied. And Adina, you used the word believe, and I think one of the things that we've let happen as scientists is to let that word creep into areas where it doesn't apply. Like there are things that you can believe in or not.
Absolutely.
And then there are things where you don't get to decide to believe in them or not, except, if what you're referring to is, well, I'm observing the world, I'm looking at the evidence, and, I don't get to have a belief or not about gravity or cancer or the effectiveness of modern medicine or how the climate has been changing and what that has to do with the changes that people
there are
have made
no
to the
alternate
atmosphere.
facts.
That's right. And this whole idea that, exactly, reality is that all of reality is sort of a matter of opinion. We let that slip in the U.S. I don't feel like that's really happened everywhere else in the world to the same degree. And so I think we have a real responsibility as scientists to get clear about that.
Yeah. Tommy had a question?
Yeah, we just got a question from Ray Newkirk. As a vegetarian my entire life, I feel this question. So the question to both Adina and Erica is, in speaking of solutions, I never hear anyone talk about not eating meat. What do the guests think about the effects of the livestock industry on our environment? And yeah, I'm also very interested to hear what our
Adina, you deal a lot with water, and I guess one of the impacts is use of water for crops that then are fed to the animals. What other impacts? Is methane an issue?
All of the above. I think the lower on the food chain we eat, the better. The smaller our carbon footprint, and the better it's for the environment. Having said that, I typically don't tell people, oh, you have to be vegetarian, you don't need to eat meat, but I explain the consequences and let people make their choices. It might be reducing the number of days a week they eat meat. It might be buying more sustainable crops. It might be buying a hybrid car or an electric car. So if people have a plethora of solutions where they can contribute, I think it is more likely that they will pick and choose what they can do and contribute in that way, as opposed of just, again, going all the way extreme and alienating people.
Yeah.
Good point. I
I
mean, if
agree.
you had a chart that said, here's what this cost you in carbon, eat a hamburger or drive your Prius, your pick, but both of them are equal. If you knew that, maybe you'd make a wiser choice than guessing all the time.
If only they were equal, though. Because
Well, we don't know.
By the way, Ray,
I
Ray, thanks a lot for that question. And just so you know, we actually have addressed it on this show 2 or 3 times, but only in passing mentions. Now, that's not because we're afraid to bring. We're going to bring up the issue. We'll have a whole show or more about this, okay? And meanwhile, I recommend to everybody listening, you watch this film. The name sounds really weird. It's Cowspiracy. And that is a real eye-opener if half of it is true. And I still need to get it and watch it and rewatch it and rewatch it and try to vet and verify all the claims that are made in there. I'll bet you a whole bunch of them are right. I know Ray has seen that movie also. Anyway, that's your homework, dear viewers, dear listeners. And then we'll have a show on this thing, on the whole meat
And
thing.
can I just add something? I would love to just point out also that just in general, I mean, if you're going to assign homework the homework to me would be, think about the life cycle of the thing it is that you're consuming, whether it's the new Prius you're buying or the meat you're eating or the industrial broccoli. I mean, it's not, you have to ask where things are coming from. And one of the things that drives me crazy is, these parking spots that are special reserved for low emissions vehicles. You have to make the car. So you have to look at what are the relative costs of buying the new thing that is lower emissions, that had parts shipped from all over the world to construct it, relative to keeping something older that's still working. I mean, I just think that whether it's meat versus a vegetarian diet that we're talking about, or buying a hybrid car versus, making something continue to work that you've had in the past, that it's not always the simple answer. It's not always,
Right.
the new fancy thing is better, and it's not always that. I mean, as a matter of principle, lower on the food chain is better. But if you're raising your own chickens or buying your neighbor's beef that's grass-fed and rain irrigated,
Right.
that's a really different thing than the industrial meat that's
Totally
in that
agree.
movie that Joe's talking about.
Right, and really one thing you're pointing out is the complexity of our worlds have put it back to consumers to try to figure this out, and really, in some ways, that's just not fair. That's why we have organized governments for policy, so that it's helping us figure this stuff out. Because the way the supply chain of all this material goods that we consume is so complicated, even figuring out which parts are made in this country is almost impossible. So how would you figure out which has got the higher carbon footprint, a Prius or a Leaf? So really standardizing our approaches to things so that consumers can make good choices without having to become consumer scientists themselves would be
And
nice.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's
Absolutely.
incredibly, policy is I'm sorry.
We're all nodding our heads.
I guess I just wanted to remind that where policy comes from is the people you elect, and I was really mortified at how many people chose not to vote in this most recent election. I think that's a very, very fundamental part of even though we're talking about science and we're talking about the environment, being civically engaged, voting, making sure that there aren't barriers to people being able to register to vote, that is a fundamental way. That's how democracy works. And so in order to get those policies, which you're absolutely right are the ones we need,
Got to elect the right people. Yeah. Erica, I
they
want to
need
thank
both
you.
vote and defend others' rights.
Go vote. Thank you, Erica Zavaleta, for being here with us by phone from Colorado. And thank you to Adina Payton, who is a professor of marine sciences at UC Santa Cruz. Thank you both for being here on Planet Watch.
Any parting thought from Adina? Anything burning to say? Or?
I'm just amazed that in this period time of such wide available knowledge, a lot of this information is not broadly available.
Well, we're working to
We're
change
working
that.
on that.
Thank you.
Go for
Thank
it.
you both for being here.
Thank you for having us.
This is a great show. Thanks so much for having us.
Yeah, look forward to seeing you back in the cruise here soon down along Westcliff Drive there, Erica.
Great. I'll be back next week.
Great.
And don't forget, there is a UC Santa Cruz Climate Conference coming up right here in Santa Cruz if you're in the area, starting next weekend, Friday night, the keynote, and then going through Saturday of next weekend. We have a couple more minutes to close here, and I would like to mention that we are on YouTube.com on KSCO Global channel, but for now we're no longer on Facebook Live just for this week till we iron out some copyright issues, apparently. So thank you for your patience on that one. But you can find the archive shows here on Planet Watch, Radio Planet Watch on Facebook, our page. You can go there and find the audio and the video archived later on in case you just tuned into the tail end of our show and wished you had caught the whole thing. Next week on the program, we'll have a fantastic guest, somebody who's appearing at the climate conference. And Joe, if you could just give a really short capsule of who our next guest will be next week.
That'll be Mark Jacobson of Stanford. A lot of people have heard of him. He and I actually used to work in the same office at NASA Ames. But anyway, he's a world expert now on getting much more of our energy, or maybe even all of it, from renewable energy. And we'll be doing probably a phone interview with him. But anyway, it'll be very interesting. So
And I'm
tune
looking
in.
to set up some recording techniques up there so I can get some of these other scientists who are on the panels to be on this show later on. So just a few minutes we have left. Any last thoughts, Joe, on... Anything you would like to leave us with?
Yeah, we're bracing for wild and woolly weather here in the west with a lot of wind. And hey, we were talking about wind power, and I have just a little interesting fact for you. When the wind speed doubles, guess what happens to the actual powerfulness, the wind power? Well, it's a cubic function.
You can't tell the answer till next week, or it won't be a brain teaser.
Well, no, I got another brain teaser
Okay,
for you.
okay.
I'll tell you the answer on this one. If it doubles, well, a factor of 2 cubed is 8. The wind power goes up by 8. So, okay, now here comes if it triples, if the wind speed triples, what happens to the level of wind power? Again, it's a cubic function, so a factor of 3
It blows down trees.
to the, yes, 3 to the third power, 3 cubed is
27.
27 times as powerful. So there you go. Now here comes the little puzzler for you. Geography and world geometry. If you're in Alaska, Anchorage, Alaska, say, facing directly towards Washington, D.C.,
And you can see Sarah Palin.
you could say almost the root of all evil. You are facing directly to Washington, D.C. What direction of the compass are you facing? What is the bearing of Washington, D.C. from Anchorage, Alaska? I'll give you a hint. I mean, everybody would think, you look at a map, a Mercator projection of the world, looks like Washington, D.C. is southeast. But you are not facing southeast if you are facing along a straight line along the curved surface of the earth, geodesic line to
Don't
Washington.
tell,
You're
don't
facing
tell,
some
don't.
other direction. No, I'm just saying it's not southeast. So anyway, we'll tell the answer.
limits it.
Stay tuned next week for the suspenseful conclusion. And here's your homework. Get a string. Get a globe. Find a globe somewhere. Put a string on it from Anchorage to Washington, D.C. Make that string totally straight. And then look at the latitude lines locally right around Anchorage, and you will see what direction the string is facing right there. I mean, as you travel along that line, the bearing does indeed change. And eventually it does become southeast the farther towards Washington you go. But right at Anchorage, it's something else. It's something else. Very surprising.
Very, very cool. And one really quick thing, go look up something called NASA Eyes. There is a simulation. You can get an application on your computer, and it will show you the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, the amount of heat, the amount of sea level rise, and this is all from the lower geostationary satellites. It's about 12 different data sets you can simulate, and it will show you in color, 3D, what all these things are.
One last quick one, which Rachael and I did this week. It's going to be raining, at least here and around Santa Cruz this week, like today, big time, I think. Go out and look at a puddle or a little shell with a pool of water in it, and on the surface of the water you will see these little silver balls of water dancing and gliding and skittering around. It's a weird surface tension effect, and we have a video of it that I want to show you sometime, or we'll put it up on our Facebook page. But you saw those, right, last week, Rachael? Or oh, hey, he's got it on there now.
All right,
Look
he
at that.
doesn't-
He's got it on there. Look at all those little balls of water. Those are not bubbles. They're little spheres full of water that, by weird surface tension effect, are skittering around on the surface of the water. They're created at the impact when the raindrop hits the water. Anyway, that's a world premiere video. Nobody else that I know of has ever shown that on video. Gerald Walker, who wrote The Flying Circus of Physics, he wrote about the phenomenon, but I've noticed it for years, and I showed it to Ken Norris, and he was blown away. Anyway.
All right. Well, we want to thank you for tuning in once again to Planet Watch right here on your radio station dial, and we will be back with you again next week. You can write to us at radioplanetwatch@gmail.com. I'm Rachael Ann Goodman.
Joe Jordan. And Tommy and Jason. Thanks so much
Bye,
to everybody.
everybody.
And Adina, thanks you so much.
Thank you.
We'll see you next week.
KSCO, Santa Cruz.
CBS News, I'm Pam Coulter. The White House is doubling down on President Trump's criticism of the news media, which he called the enemy of the American people.